All right, good afternoon. My name is Ingrid Heckel, and I'm a conservation and land use specialist with the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program through a partnership with Cornell University. Welcome to the Conservation and Land Use webinar series. Our topic today is an introduction to the various species designations for plants and animals of conservation concern in New York State. Our speakers will walk us through the nuances of different legal designations and a variety of other conservation ranks, how they relate to regulatory protections, and how they're addressed in reviewing projects. Before we start, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. You should be able to connect to the audio through your computer or by phone. Click Connect Audio at the bottom of the screen to find different audio options or switch your audio connection. And if you're having difficulties with sound, I recommend calling in by phone or requesting a callback. If you need help, please reach out to us via the chat box in the bottom right corner of the screen. If you have questions for the speakers during their talk, please use the Q&A function, which is accessible by clicking on the three dots next to the chat icon. Note that your phone lines have been muted. The webinar is being recorded and we will notify you when the recording is posted. At the end of the webinar, we kindly request your feedback through a short survey that's going to pop up. And lastly, for those of you seeking municipal training credit, you'll receive an automatic email confirmation of attendance from WebEx at the end of the program. For those of you who may be new to our series, the Hudson River Estuary Program is a unique program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, established to help people enjoy, protect, and revitalize the Hudson River and its valley. We work throughout the 10 counties bordering the tidal Hudson, shown here on the map, to achieve many key benefits, including the vital estuary ecosystem and its fisheries and habitats, clean water, healthy tributaries, climate adaptive communities, conserved natural areas in the watershed, and an informed and engaged public, and access for all to the Hudson River. Within the estuary program, our conservation and land use team works with municipalities and regional conservation partners to help incorporate important habitats and natural areas into local land use planning and decision making. Our program website is a clearinghouse for information and guidance on these topics, and we hope you'll check it out. As part of our team's amphibian migrations and road crossings project, we're offering a three-part webinar series starting next week that will more deeply explore the ecology and conservation of pool breeding amphibians and their habitat. The series will include presentations from researchers and practitioners from New York and New England who will share expertise and strategies to help prevent amphibian road mortality during breeding migrations and achieve more effective conservation of vernal pools. You will be directed to the webpage where you can register for these and other programs at the end of the event. Our guest speakers today are Dr. Dan Rosenblatt and Nick Conrad. Dan is a New York native and has been the Wildlife Diversity Section Head at New York State DEC since 2007, with oversight of all state programs regarding the conservation of non-marine wildlife that are not generally hunted or trapped in New York. He previously worked for DEC out of the Stony Brook office as Regional Wildlife Manager and an endangered species biologist. And prior to coming to DEC, Dan earned his PhD in wildlife biology from the University of Illinois, researching the impacts of forest fragmentation on mammal community structure. Nick Conrad is the Information Resources Coordinator with the New York Natural Heritage Program, where he manages the biodiversity databases and production of data products and provides them to municipalities, land trusts, state and federal agencies, and researchers. Nick received a master's in zoology from the University of New Hampshire and has been with the New York Natural Heritage Program for almost 30 years. As I pass the screen over to Nick and Dan, I'll note that we'll take a break for a few questions after the introduction to species listings and natural heritage conservation ranks. And we're aiming to leave about 15 minutes of time at the end of the program for additional Q&A. Thank you both for joining us, and go Nick.
Thank you, Ingrid, for inviting Dan and me to speak today. And thank you, everyone, for attending. As Ingrid said, we'll be talking about the different systems and kinds of designations that we give to the special species in New York that are rare. And Dan and I, oops, hold on. Dan and I will be tag teaming on this, and he'll start off by talking about the threatened and endangered and special concern animal listings, and I'll follow by talking about how plant listings are different, and then I'll talk about the natural heritage conservation status ranks, and then Dan will return with talking about species of greatest conservation need and other protected wildlife categories. And then I'll say a few words about unlisted animals and plants in project reviews. And I'll talk about where to find information on all these species. So I'll turn it over to Dan to get us started.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Ingrid, and thanks to the Hudson River Estuary Program for inviting us to give the talk today. What Nick and I are basically going to be setting out to do is to try to give you guys enough background on the various categories so that you kind of have an understanding of what they mean. So as we go through these, we're going to basically be starting off with, at least in this case, essentially the most protective of categories, which actually are based on law and regulation. We'll go through all the various categories as we go along, but we're going to keep trying to make those ties back to what the designation means and where that designation came from. So I'm going to be starting off with the threatened and endangered categorization along with special concern. These are based on law and regulation, and they do convey very specific protections along with permitting requirements that come into play under certain circumstances where these species are potentially threatened or taken. There's a regulatory list of what is a threatened, endangered, and special concern species, and in order to change that list, you actually have to go through the formal state regulatory process. So that means there has to be a proposal, public review, ultimately adoption, and a rewriting of the state regulatory framework to change actually not only the list of species, but any of the rules that apply to them, such as the permitting requirements. Next slide. So the endangered species law is actually pretty old within New York State. It actually predates the federal ESA. It's been around since 1970. It basically does two main things. Section 1 of the endangered species law essentially defines endangered, threatened, and special concern species and authorizes us to essentially create a list of what those protected species are. And more importantly, Section 2 prohibits the taking of any endangered or threatened species except under license or permit from the department. So that's essentially where the protection for threatened and endangered species comes from. It's important to note here that Section 2 does not apply to special concern species. So special concern species don't fall under the same licensing or permitting requirements as endangered and threatened. And we're actually going to revisit special concern species a couple times later on in the presentation. But within the context of what a taking is, that's the regulatory and legal language where permits essentially kind of come into play. Taking is essentially defined as pursuing, shooting, hunting, killing, capturing, trapping, snaring, and netting, and all lesser acts such as disturbing, harrying, or worrying. It's very broad in that context. But within the endangered species regulations, next slide, Nick. There's a refinement to this definition that only applies to endangered and threatened species. Next slide. So Part 182 is the regulatory rules that govern the endangered species law. Under these definitions, we actually have more precise definitions of what an endangered species or a threatened species actually are. There's basically two things that a species has to be. It has to be native, and it has to be in imminent danger of extirpation in New York. There's a list of criteria within the regulation that are used to evaluate that risk. And there's also sort of a second shortcut to being an endangered species. If a species is listed by the federal government, it's automatically given the same protective category under New York state law and regulation. Next slide. Threatened species, the definition essentially is just essentially that the species is likely to become endangered in New York in the foreseeable future, again, as based against off of those criteria, which I'll go over in a second. And similarly to endangered species, if they're listed as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act, then they're automatically listed by state law. Next slide. So species of special concern are a different category. They're found to be at risk of becoming threatened in New York. And this category is sort of a catch-all of species that might actually be moving in two different directions. It's not uncommon in New York for a species that was previously listed as threatened, such as an osprey, to be listed as a species of special concern, sort of as a placeholder so that folks kind of continue to pay attention to it, even though the reason it was delisted is that its distribution had basically been reestablished throughout most of the state and populations were still increasing. But you also have species that are added to species of special concern that are moving in the other direction, that are essentially experiencing declines in populations or they're facing new threats. I'll get back to this at the end of the talk, but where species of special concern makes a difference and where it actually has some regulatory protection, there's a legal definition of protected wildlife, and under that definition, species of special concern qualify. And I'll hit back on that a little bit later in the talk. The rest I'm going to be focusing on essentially what it means to be an endangered and threatened species and how they're protected. Next slide. So how a species winds up being listed, I mentioned that there was the criteria that are in the regulation. I'm not going to read these all, but generally speaking, the listing criteria are based in most general terms on how the population of that species is doing within New York State. In some cases, we bring in information from surrounding states. There's certainly extra weight that's put into the evaluation of a species if it's listed by our neighbors. That includes the provinces of Ontario and Quebec to our north and our surrounding states. The evaluation of threats is actually an important piece of this too. And next slide, Nick. If there's activities, human activities in particular, that are increasing or are continuing to have a direct impact on the population, that bears into it. The emergence of disease or new threats. White nose syndrome is probably one of the most prominent examples of recent changes that prompted changes to northern long-eared bats on the federal level and added a listed bat species here in New York. Criteria number 8 is also important, is the adequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. That sometimes, even though a species might be rare in New York, in some cases, the habitats that that species relies on might have full protection. And particularly if the species is also already protected wildlife, if its habitat is also protected, the need to list the species isn't necessarily as great as it may be for other species that don't have those existing protections. And ultimately, the determination is based on essentially a 10 to 20 year window where we're looking at the species and making the determination as to whether or not it's possible that we might lose that species from New York over that time period. That would essentially qualify the species as endangered. If you're looking towards a non-asymptotic decline that's longer than that, the species might be listed as threatened. If a species is essentially stable and projected to be present in New York for the foreseeable future, it wouldn't qualify as threatened or endangered. Next slide. So getting back to what's actually protected and what that protection means, it really comes down to what is a take or taking. And as I mentioned before, under the environmental conservation law, the word take is actually defined as what you see here on the slide. The important part here is the all lesser acts, such as disturbing, harrying, or worrying. Under the Part 182 Endangered Species Regulations, if you go to the next slide, lesser acts actually includes the adverse modification of habitat. And this is essentially the result of a couple of lawsuits that were implemented over the history of the endangered species law within New York State that concluded that Under certain circumstances, if habitat is being removed for a particular species, particularly if the species is present within that habitat, that essentially that can result in essentially a take of listed species. So one of the things that's kind of unique to endangered and threatened species is the fact that there is some protection for habitat. I'm going to go through a list of definitions as to how that is essentially applied. And before I go any further, I just wanted to point out that one of the key parts of the endangered species law and the Part 182 regulations is in New York, all of these rules only apply to animal species. They don't apply to plants. Nick's going to go into that a little bit later. But just to make sure that folks are aware that there's a clear difference between how listed plants and listed animals are protected and addressed. So all these definitions that I'm talking about just apply to listed animal species. Next slide. So adverse modification of habitat would mean that any alteration of occupied habitat that is likely to negatively affect one or more essential behaviors. So there's a couple of additional defined terms that I'm going to go through. The important thing is to realize that the protection for habitat only extends to occupied habitat, and there's a specific mechanism for us identifying what is occupied habitat. Next slide. So occupied habitat is essentially defined as a location within New York where the department has documented the exhibition of essential behaviors by a listed species. So there's another definition that we have to get into, that essential behavior definition. But the important thing here is that under the regulations, once designated as occupied habitat, that designation continues until essentially either the habitat is no longer suitable or that appropriate monitoring has been implemented indicating that the area is not likely to be reoccupied. That would essentially mean that there's no species on the local landscape that are likely to be using that habitat in the near future. So next slide. Essential behavior is essentially what would have to be observed in order to allow for us to designate a location as occupied habitat. So an essential behavior is something that's a required part of the life cycle, something that the animals would have to do in order to survive. This definition is here because the intent of the regulations is not to kind of create sort of like a George Washington slept here regulatory program that wherever an endangered species was ever seen, that area is automatically protected. You know, thinking of migratory fish and birds as examples, technically speaking, that would mean that, you know, every inch of the marine environment, every inch of the Hudson River would have to be protected for sturgeon or the various sea turtles or whales because they've been spotted at some point in time within those areas. And same thing with the terrestrial habitat. Listed birds would have been seen flying over almost any location within New York State at any point in time. Essential behavior essentially means that these are areas where the animals are essentially documented breeding, hibernating, reproducing, feeding, sheltering for extended periods of time, or are determined to be essential to migration and overwintering. So essentially, the department has to have, in most cases, with the exception of breeding, multiple observations of an area being used by multiple individuals in order to essentially document an area as occupied habitat. Next slide. So ultimately, what does it mean if a species is protected, you have occupied habitat identified, and you know, somebody has a project that's proposed that would impact a threatened or endangered species? Under the Part 182 regulations, there's a permit issuance standard that was established called net conservation benefit. That means that ultimately, when the project is completed, that there's elements of the project that essentially would result in the species or its habitat being better off at the completion of the project than if the project was not undertaken. So essentially, that would either mean it's likely that reproduction is increased, the extent and suitability of habitat is increased, or some other reasonably expected outcome that would contribute towards the recovery of the species is part of the project. And that's frequently referenced as the mitigation or net conservation benefit plan that's associated with whatever the impact is. Next slide. So as I went through, where this actually applies is if we have occupied habitat, or if a proposed action is anticipated to have potentially an impact directly on a threatened or endangered species. There's certain projects and certain project types that can cause mortality without necessarily removing habitat. Those sorts of projects would be under jurisdiction 2. Our process is basically the same as any of our other standard DEC permits, such as wetlands or clean water certificates and other permits along those lines that go through our regional division of environmental permits. And basically, once an application comes in, we have 30 days to respond. So ultimately, this is our most regulatory based program that's focused on those endangered and threatened animal species. The rest of the protections are going to be a little bit different. We'll get into those a little bit later. The next issue that I want to address, next slide, Nick, is how the lists are revised. And as I mentioned before, it's you actually have to go through the full regulatory review process. And there's basically 2 ways a list is revised, as I mentioned before. Under the definitions, whenever there's a change in federal listing status, the New York state law essentially accommodates that. So northern long-eared bats, for example, were immediately added to New York State's list of threatened species when the Fish and Wildlife Service listed them in 2015. New York State did release a pre-proposal for public review and public comment in the fall of 2019, and that was a comprehensive review of the entire list. That pre-proposal was based on our 2015 species status assessments that went into the State Wildlife Action Plan. We had hoped to initiate changes in 2020, but because of COVID impacts and actually retirement of the project lead during that time period, that project has been set back a little bit. But we do still hope to make changes to the list over the next 4 years. And the approach is probably going to be focused sort of in various taxonomic groups with aquatic, aquatic marine resources, invertebrates, reptiles and amphibians, and birds and mammals probably being tackled in that order, specifically with the intent of having the list revised by 2025 when the next State Wildlife Action Plan is issued. The reason for the birds and mammals being towards the end is we're in the middle of our 3rd breeding bird atlas right now, which is going to be complete in 2024. And we also have an active mammal distribution study in conjunction with ESF and the Natural Heritage Program that's updating our distributional information on all mammal species in New York. That's also supposed to be done by 2024. So pending the results of those studies, they'll be very meaningful as far as informing any changes to those species groups. So what would happen is the department would essentially put out a notice of proposed rulemaking with a draft list of changes, again, solicit public comment. Based on that public comment, we would revise the proposal and put forth hopefully a final proposal that would be adopted that would incorporate the changes at that time. So the regulatory process, once a notice goes out, generally takes about, there's a 60-day public comment period. It takes generally between 6 to 8 months after a proposal is initially made before it's adopted. That can take a little bit longer if there are significant revisions. And that's my review of endangered and threatened species. I'll pass it back to Nick.
Thanks, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, he was talking about animals, and state protected plants are a little bit different. In contrast to animals, environmental conservation law treats plant protection somewhat less strictly. The New York State Protective Native Plant Law says it is a violation for any person to pick, pluck, sever, remove, damage, or carry away any protected plant without the consent of the landowner. So basically, if the landowner doesn't care, there's no violation of the law. And if somebody does harm a plant on land without the landowner's permission, they're subject to fines for each plant harmed or illegally taken of $25 per plant. So in some cases, that's not much of a deterrent. I also find it interesting that the law says, specifies pick, pluck, sever, remove, as if those are all different things. And somebody could say, well, I didn't pick it, I plucked it. And so they had to put every variation in the law. The categories for protected plants are endangered and threatened, same categories that animals use, the same names at least, but they have a couple of additional categories. One is rare, and the last one is exploitably vulnerable. So I'm going to explain what exploitably vulnerable is first. And these are plants that aren't rare in New York, but they're subject to harvesting and collection that would seriously diminish their populations in a local area. And these are collectible species such as orchids or ferns or showy wildflowers, or plants that people think have medicinal qualities and that are foraged for a lot, like wild ginseng. The list of protected plants, the link to a list of protected plants is on the DEC website at this link. And the definitions, I'm going to hold off on definitions for endangered, threatened, and rare for now, because in deciding which species are listed as endangered, threatened, or rare, DEC uses the species statuses made by the New York Natural Heritage Program. And so I'll talk about these heritage species statuses next. So who is the New York Natural Heritage Program, and who are they to have their own species designations? Well, we're a program formally recognized in environmental conservation law to track the status and locations of rare species and ecosystems. And DEC has contracted with the Nature Conservancy to provide the Natural Heritage Program starting in 1985 until 2012, when Natural Heritage became a program of SUNY ESF. So we are now a program of SUNY ESF working under an MOU with DEC. And I want to point out our membership in NatureServe, the nonprofit organization serving the network of natural heritage programs in the US and Canada. And NatureServe staff have developed methodology and tools used by many heritage programs, including the species status ranks that I'll be talking about. So this is our full mission, our formal mission statement. Basically, our mission is to facilitate the conservation of New York's biodiversity with information and expertise. And the major way we do that is by maintaining the most comprehensive database on New York State's imperiled biodiversity and on its ecosystems. But we can't keep track in our database of every species in the state. So how do we include which species, or how do we decide which species to include? What we call the heritage methodology looks at two components of biodiversity that will give the most return on our investment in terms of conserving all of the state's plant and animal species. We keep track of locations of imperiled plants and animals, what we call the fine filter, and we keep track of significant natural communities, what we call the coarse filter, because by protecting communities, you protect all the species that use those communities' habitat. And I won't be talking about communities today. So how do we decide what imperiled means and what species qualify as imperiled? Imperiled is the risk of disappearing, in this case from New York State. If a species disappears from New York, it's called extirpation. If a species disappears from its entire range on the planet, it's called extinction. Imperiled and rare are two terms that are often used interchangeably, but in this context, there's a subtle difference. Rarity refers to the number of individuals or number of populations of a species, let's say in New York State. But for a species that may not be very rare in terms of its current numbers, if it's threatened with factors that could likely decimate those numbers, then it might be at a higher risk of disappearing from the state, even higher risk than a species that is currently less numerous. So imperilment looks at all the factors facing a species, including but not limited to how many there are. So how do we assess the level of imperilment of a species in New York? We assign each species a global and state conservation status rank. Now, these are that's the formal name for what people often call heritage ranks. A global conservation rank or global rank or G rank is an assessment of the risk of the species disappearing from the world. And a state conservation rank or a state rank or an S rank is an assessment of the risk of imperilment of the species in New York, the risk of its disappearing from New York. Global ranks are assigned by NatureServe with the input of many experts, and state ranks are assigned by the New York Natural Heritage Program with the input of many experts. The basic ranks run from 1 to 5, and so with 1, G1 or S1 being the most imperiled, and G5 or S5 being the least imperiled or the most secure. So we look at several factors, ranking factors, in deciding what rank to assign a species. There are 10 ranking factors grouped into 3 categories. Rarity is weighted 70% when assigning a rank, and there are seven measures of rarity, 7 factors here. Rarity is how numerous the species is, as I mentioned, and the first measure here is just a straightforward number of individuals or population size. The other factors also reflect rarity, such as range extent or the area, number of acres in New York occupied by that species. These other rarity factors are relied on more when we don't have a good straight population size available. The last factor here, environmental specificity or habitat specificity, is listed as optional, which means that we don't use it unless we don't have good estimates of the other rarity factors. We also look at threats to the species, and those are weighted 30%. The threats include habitat loss and degradation, pollution, overharvesting, invasive species, and more recently, climate change. And I'll talk a little bit about those in more detail in a minute. So an initial rank is calculated based on rarity and threats, and then that initial rank is modified by looking at trends for the species. Is it increasing or decreasing in the state? We look at both short-term trends, that is over the last 10 years or 3 generations of the species, and long-term trends over the last 200 years. As you would expect, the long-term trends are the ranking factor that we have the biggest gaps in data for. A species with relatively large numbers but suffering a high percentage decline in the last 10 or more years will get a more imperiled rank than just the current numbers would indicate, because this is a measure of imperilment and not just rarity. So we approach threats looking at 2 aspects of threats: the scope of the threat, that is the percentage of the population in the state affected by that threat, and then the severity of this threat, the projected effect of that threat on population size over 10 years or 3 generations. And we use this matrix, and as of course, you know, a pervasive and extremely severe threat gets the highest threat score, whereas a severe threat that only affects a small percentage of the state's population, that species, gets a low threat score. And similarly, a threat experienced by most or all of the populations in New York, that is, it's pervasive, but that has slight impacts, will also get a low value for threats. So all those ranking factors under this assessment methodology, all those ranking factors get scores, weighted scores, and these scores are then combined into one score, which translates, the scores are combined and they translate to a global and state conservation status rank. And here are the state conservation status ranks. And S1 is considered critically imperiled. S2 is imperiled. S3 is vulnerable or uncommon. S4 is apparently secure or common. S5 is demonstrably secure or abundant in New York State. And similarly, there are G1, G2, G3, G4, and G5 ranks. So looking at the full definition of a couple of these ranks, S1, the full definition of S1 or critically imperiled in New York State is at very high risk of disappearing from New York due to very few populations, that is 5 or fewer populations in the state, very few individuals, very restricted range or remaining acres, very steep decline, severe threats, or other factors. In contrast, the full definition of S2 or imperiled is at high risk of disappearing from New York due to few populations. Here we're talking 6 to 20 populations rather than 5 or less, or due to restricted range, few individuals, steep declines, severe threats, or other factors. There are some other conservation status ranks we use. If a species is known historically from the state but has not been seen in the past 35 years, we give it a rank of SH. SH species, we don't know of any current locations, but there's still potential habitat out there, and they could still be found, could be rediscovered. In contrast, a species that all the experts agree is apparently gone from New York State is assigned an SX rank. There are a couple of ways of indicating uncertainty about a rank. The first one is a question mark after the rank. If, in this case, an S2 question mark, if the ranking factors indicate different ranks, some ranking factors indicate one rank and others indicate another, or there's a lack of good information for a lot of the factors, then we might tentatively assign it S2 but not be quite certain of it. If we give it a question mark, then it's most likely S2. And once we get more information, we can take the question mark off. If the ranking factors, some of them fall in S1 or some of them fall in S2, and we're not, equally could go either way, we'll give it a rank of S1, S2, and hopefully in the future, more information will allow us to more firmly assign it to either S1 or to S2. For migrating species in the state that have different, that use different locations between breeding and non-breeding seasons, and those different locations are actually occupied by different individuals, then the breeding and non-breeding populations each get their own conservation status rank. The breeding population gets a B rank, and the non-breeding population gets a non-breeding rank, an N rank. And so, for example, the bald eagle here, the breeding populations get S2, S3, B, whereas the non-breeding or wintering bald eagles in New York State get a conservation status rank of S2, S2N. So the full conservation status rank of bald eagle is a mouthful: S2, S3B, S2N. And the bald eagle is a good example of that. Status ranks aren't set in stone. They change in time as more information becomes available. And for example, many of the bird conservation status ranks were assessed and revised as necessary after the completion of the second breeding bird atlas. And many bird ranks will be reassessed and probably revised after the current breeding bird atlas ends in 2025. And the bald eagles are doing very well, so they're very likely to maybe get an upgrade in rank. I'll point out that the There is one species in New York, that's a G1S1. Chinanango ovate amber snail is globally critically imperiled and state critically imperiled. And that's because there's only one location of it in the whole world, and that location is in New York State, in Chinanango Falls State Park. And it's the only animal that is endemic to New York. It's found only in New York. So going back to our original question, what species do we track their locations in the heritage database? Well, after we've assigned these conservation status ranks to all the species, we track in our database the locations, all locations we can, of all the S1 and S2 species, critically imperiled and imperiled species. And we also track locations of the SH and SX species. So a couple examples, Indiana bat is G2S1, globally imperiled and critically imperiled in New York State. The sea pink is a G5S2 plant. G5 means it's abundant in the globe, so across its range, it's abundant. It's not in danger of going extinct in the world at all. But in New York, it's imperiled, S2. And that's because New York is at the edge of its range. So that's a very common situation where there'll be a high G rank and a low S rank, where a species is not in any danger of going extinct, but it's found at the very edge of its range in New York in specific habitats. So in New York, it's rare, it's imperiled. So the heritage database, and I know some of you have used heritage data quite a bit, but the database includes under imperiled and rare species. It includes, as I said, all the S1 and S2 animals. These capture most, but not all, animal species listed by the state as endangered and threatened, the ones that Dan just talked about. Most, but not all of them. So we do include in our database locations of all endangered and threatened animals, regardless of their conservation status rank. The S1 and S2 animals include many of the special concern animals, but not all of them, just some of them. And the S1 and S2 species, all the rest of them, all the rest of the S1 and S2 animals are unlisted rare animals. And these don't have any legal protection under the laws that Dan was talking about. For plants, we include, as I said, all the S1 and S2 species. We also track, we don't track locations of S3 species in our database, but we do put them on our watch list and periodically assess them to see if they have declined and should be re-ranked to S1 or S2. And I mentioned that for the legal listing of plants, endangered, threatened, and rare, that the state uses the heritage conservation statuses in deciding which plants get those legal listings, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we publish a list of all the species we track in our database and their conservation status ranks in our rare plant and rare animal status list. These are available on our website at nhp.org. And there the rare animal status list lists the 476 rare animals we track in our database, and the rare plant status list lists the 822 rare plants that we track in our database. So some applications of conservation status ranks is that they can serve to help set priorities for conservation efforts and planning by land trust and state and federal agencies and municipalities who want to protect the most imperiled aspects of their natural resources. The status ranks are not, the heritage status ranks are not regulatory in and of themselves, but they can be one piece of information for determining animal legal protected listings. And as I mentioned, they do play a role in the legal protection list for plants. And going back to a version of this slide, the definitions of endangered, threatened, and rare in the state protected native plant regulations define those categories using the definitions of the heritage state conservation rings. So the protected plant list is updated about every 10 years. And when it is, the DEC looks to those heritage rings and bases its legal listings on those. So any S1, any plant ranked S1 is listed as endangered, any S2 plant is listed as threatened, and any S3 plant is listed as rare. Now, again, the Heritage Program will re-rank some of these plants over time. Those don't automatically lead to a change in the protected list, the state listing. That has to come the next time the protected list is formally revised, going through the regulatory process, very similar to the way the plant protected list is also revised that Dan described. But for the most part, there's a much closer tie between heritage status ranks and the state legal protection statuses for plants than there is for animals. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan, who will talk about some other protected statuses of animals.
Thanks, Nick. If you go ahead, unfortunately on this slide, I'm going to have to ask you to go next a couple times, but
oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk now about species of greatest conservation need, frequently abbreviated SGCN, and sometimes just spoken as if SGCN was a word that people understood. Species of greatest conservation need comes out of the State Wildlife Grant Program that was created through congressional legislation back in 2002. Next, Nick. The program basically grew out of something that had been called the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, which was pushed kind of hard throughout the 90s to try to identify a new source of funding for the conservation of wildlife diversity in general. The idea was to try to build the funding sources that are available for wildlife management in the United States. The primary source of funding for wildlife management actually comes through a program called the Pittman-Robertson and another program called the Dingell-Johnson Act that have the more common names of wildlife restoration and sport fish restoration programs. They're essentially funded through the sale of firearms and fishing equipment. And there's a tax that essentially gets apportioned by the Fish and Wildlife Service out to the states to fund our what many consider to be the traditional fish and wildlife management programs. They allow for the acquisition of property, the management of habitat, and essentially the proliferation of birds, mammals, and sport fish. So very, very sort of limited in what the applicability of those funding sources are. And the idea was through state wildlife grants that the funding would be available for all wildlife species. Next slide. And part of the requirement in order for states to be able to access this new source of funding was we were required to designate species of greatest conservation need. And the way the funding essentially works is that the sideboards on it restrict states to spending funds made available through this program only on species of greatest conservation need. So next slide. It's subject to annual congressional legislation. So every year the program has to get reauthorized. And as a result, the sort of sideboards on the program have changed throughout the years. It started off at a funding level for New York State at $3.7 million that the state was eligible for. But for the last 10 years, the program has vacillated back and forth between $2.1 and $2.4 million a year. So it's kind of hard to build sort of a long-term program on essentially on a variable funding source that in any particular year might get cut out of the budget entirely. But it is better than where things were prior to 2002. And next slide, Nick. And one of the requirements that came about in 2005, that's a continuing program requirement for the program since then, is that every 10 years, states have to submit and have approved essentially a comprehensive wildlife conservation strategy or state wildlife action plan. That's the abbreviation CWCS and SWAP that you might hear me refer to a little bit later. Our next revision is due in 2025, so that's coming up pretty soon. And essentially what these documents are, they kind of highlight, they identify your SGCN, but they also highlight the threats that are facing those species and the habitats that they depend upon. And basically the funding can be used to address those threats, protect or manage those habitats. So it kind of broadens it a little bit broader than just spending money specifically on particular species. Next slide. So unlike the category of endangered and threatened animals, species of greatest conservation need, which by law also have to be animals, plants were not allowed to be included as species of greatest conservation need by the federal legislation. These are defined in the State Wildlife Action Plan. They're not defined in state law or in regulatory language. So within the State Wildlife Action Plan itself, it defines SGCN and splits them out into 3 different categories in our 2015 State Wildlife Action Plan. These are high priority species, species of greatest conservation need, and species of potential conservation need. Next slide. High priority species of greatest conservation need are defined as species that are in immediate need of attention, kind of similar to the guidance that Nick shared for determining what an S1 species is, that time horizon of, okay, sorry about that. For some reason, the program just shut down on me for a second. Assuming you guys could still see me. The highest priority species are essentially similar to S1 species. Basically, we're talking about in the absence of action, the populations are likely to fall into jeopardy, in which case, again, going back to other definitions, means that they might actually become endangered without intervention. And actually, the model that was used in the State Wildlife Action Plan used a lot of the same language that Nick went through as far as evaluating threats and ranking threats. So these high priority species are essentially the ones that were identified as the ones that the state should work on first and put most attention into. Next slide, Nick. And then there was an additional category of species of greatest conservation need, which were essentially species that weren't necessarily in an immediate need, but still had concerns about long-term population declines and continuing threats that essentially raised doubt as to whether or not those populations would be stable going into the future. And these species are also eligible for funding, but again, compared to the high priority species, aren't as high a priority. One of the criteria for identifying a species as an SGCN was whether or not it was state threatened or endangered. If they were listed as state threatened or endangered, they automatically became either a high priority or species of greatest conservation need. So those 2 groups represent the high priority and species of greatest conservation need are those species that funding would essentially go towards for management intervention. Next slide, Nick. And unlike our previous comprehensive wildlife conservation strategy, there was a new category called species of potential conservation need. These were species that essentially have major data gaps. We know that they occur or have occurred at some point within New York State, but there's not enough information to even really be able to meaningfully identify what their current distribution was or what their historical distribution was. So in other words, we couldn't necessarily identify trends. You didn't have enough data to be able to identify threats or any of the other criteria that were necessary to include a species as a greatest conservation need in the State Wildlife Action Plan. But by including them within this category, we were able to get funding made available for survey work. So essentially sort of like filling in data gaps. In part, this is what motivated our statewide mammal distribution study. The least weasel pictured here is only known from 2 locations in New York State over the last 30 years. We hope to be able to get additional information on species like the least weasel, least shrews, and other species. Bog lemmings are another, just as examples of species of potential conservation need. Next slide, Nick. And ultimately, the difference between SGCN and what we're going to be calling other protected wildlife is that the SGCN category is really tied to funding. And there's an associated prioritization as far as whether the department is likely to be doing work on any particular species, or it also could be viewed as species that we would support the work of others. So as far as contributing towards multi-agency efforts, regional projects with our neighboring states, or partnerships with Fish and Wildlife Service or other organizations, if a species is a SGCN, it's more likely to have state support and be able to get allow us to put in staff time and potentially fiscal resources. So just moving on to other forms of protected wildlife. So this is getting back to other forms of regulatory protection. Not quite at the level of endangered and threatened as we spoke before, but under the environmental conservation law, there is a definition of something called protected wildlife. And protected wildlife is essentially defined as all wild game. And wild game includes all the various categories of big game and small game. Protected wild birds. And protected wild birds are essentially all migratory birds protected by the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So they have to be native. So technically speaking, that would mean that starlings, house sparrows, mute swans, monk parakeets are all examples of species that aren't native to New York State, that are here, but they would not fall under the definition of protected wildlife. The fur bearers, all the various weasels, the bobcats, muskrats, lynx, beaver, coyote, all of the game birds. New York is lucky that under the definition of small game, all native reptiles and amphibians are included. So our reptiles and amphibians actually have some form of protection. And also, species of special concern, endangered and threatened species are under the definition of protected wildlife. So this kind of brings back the species of special concern, and why for particular species, largely the invertebrates in particular, and some of the fish as well, by being listed as a species of special concern, it does afford it specific protection. Next slide. So why this is important is that under the environmental conservation law, this is Article 11.0107, the application of Fish and Wildlife law, there's a broad prohibition against the take of any protected wildlife. So essentially what this winds up meaning is that if a wildlife, a particular species, falls underneath that definition of protected wildlife, it's essentially illegal for somebody to go out and harvest or harm the individual animals. And unless they're actually authorized by a permit or as allowed under the Fish and Wildlife law. And I don't have the time to go into all of the various small laws that do provide exceptions and authorizations, but I'll kind of just hit on a couple of these. Go to the next slide, Nick. So it's easiest to think of game species as an example of protected wildlife. So there's regulatory and both regulations and laws that limit how game species can be taken. We're all familiar with the idea of somebody having to have a hunting license or trapping license, that there's seasons, there's usually possession limits. You can only take a certain number of animals. The methods that you can take the animal are controlled by regulation and law. And that's all designed so that that there won't be over exploitation of those particular animals. However, all protected wildlife, regardless of whether it's a garter snake or a raccoon, outside of the hunting season, they're also protected from personal use. So if somebody wanted to do something with wildlife that protected wildlife outside of sort of the traditional hunting and trapping under a licensed season, there is a special license program within New York that can provide that authorization, but the purposes for that authorization are limited to research, scientific collection, education, rehabilitation, and exhibition. Basically, this prevents essentially the commercialization of wildlife. People can't go out, just collect animals and sell them, for example. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of odd laws and exceptions to the laws throughout the environmental conservation law, and some of them that I'm just going to highlight here, that when certain species are causing property damage, such as deer, bear, or beaver, you can get a permit from the department in order to take those animals outside of a season or without a hunting license. And there's certain species, such as the tree squirrels and blackbirds, that have specific laws written that don't even require permits under certain circumstances. So they're protected, but then there's these other rules that essentially create scenarios where that protection can be waived. And I just wanted to mention one last thing before I go into project review, and that there are a lot of weird laws that are out there that provide protection to individual species. And so you might hear from time to time things like kangaroos or alligators or crocodiles, or the latest one I believe is giraffes are protected wildlife in New York State. Yeah, they all have good intentions, but I can honestly say we've never had a free-ranging giraffe. Elephants are protected in New York, for example. So there are other examples of protected wildlife that don't kind of fit the norm, but you might see those from time to time. Okay, next slide, Nick. So ultimately, these categories that we've been talking about, they can all filter into project review. Threatened and endangered animals have to be taken into account, both under the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Anybody who has to fill out an environmental assessment form, there's a mandatory question that has to be answered as to whether or not threatened or endangered species are known to be present from that project site. And if they are, that kind of triggers an additional level of review. And if they are present, there's the full permit program under Part 182 that kind of governs whether or not a project can move forward, and if so, how. All other protected wildlife are really only protected against intentional take and direct harm. It's really only those threatened and endangered species that have some form of habitat protection associated with them. Though technically speaking, wetland-dependent species have some forms of habitat protection in the form of wetlands laws or tidal wetlands laws in the case of coastal species. But generally speaking, protected wildlife do not have explicit protections for their habitat. One of the things that I just wanted to point out, all protected wildlife, and for that matter, the unprotected species, and this is where plant protection can actually be accomplished, through the State Environmental Quality Review Act. The lead agencies essentially have the authority to require avoidance and minimization to natural resources as they see fit. So it's not uncommon for our agency and other agencies to comment on seeker coordination and provide recommendations and suggestions to try to either avoid or reduce impacts to whether it be migratory birds or in some cases even game species, waterfowl concentration areas, important migratory habitat for migratory birds. You can make those kinds of recommendations through seeker. It's just that in and of itself, those resources don't have separate regulations that entities would have to comply with in order to protect the habitat or potentially protect those species from harm. And let me just see here. And I think it goes over to Nick at this point for plants.
All right, thanks, Dan. Ingrid and Laura, I guess we were scheduled to do a little quick Q&A. Are there any pressing questions that we can answer right now before I do the last section?
I think there are a number of great questions, but based on time, it might be best for you to just run through the rest of the talk first.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So Dan just talked about project review for wildlife, for animals, and I'll talk about plants and unlisted animals in project review. You know, as he said, there are no state regulations to address impacts on unlisted plants and unlisted animals during the review of a project. Listed plants, as he said, can be addressed in seeker, but they are fully protected only when the landowner is willing. For example, the state has rules protecting listed plants on state lands. Or if the project is getting state funding, the state could put conditions in the funding to address impacts on any rare species. Plants and unlisted rare animals can be indirectly protected if the state has permitting authority over a resource such as freshwater wetlands or streams. And then the permit conditions could include measures that will also not only protect the wetland or the stream, but will also reduce impacts on unlisted species and plants. Otherwise, it's up to the permitting body or authority, or in seeker, the lead agency, as Dan mentioned, up to them to whether to require addressing impacts on unlisted rare species or on listed plants for that matter. Most often, the permitting body in New York is the town planning board. And Ingrid and her estuary program colleagues do a great job guiding municipalities in how to incorporate biodiversity in their planning and their activities, including taking into account all rare species, all imperiled species, regardless of their legal protection status. So my last section is where do you find information on these listed and rare species? Information on the species in general can be found in the Natural Heritage Conservation Guides at guides.nynhp.org. You can go in and search for a specific species or filter by different categories. We have guides for most of the species we track in our database, animals, plants, and natural communities. The summary initial page, cover page for each species includes information, including the state legal protection listing and the federal legal protection listing, and the Heritage State Conservation Status rank and the Heritage Global Conservation Status rank. Each guide also includes conservation and management considerations for that species, information about habitat, range, how to identify that species, its taxonomy, and additional resources for finding out more about that species. For many of the endangered and threatened animals in the state that are listed endangered and threatened, the DEC has fact sheets on the DEC website for many of those also. Well, what about if you need to know what listed or rare species have been documented in the vicinity of a specific location, especially important in the context of reviewing a development or other action that's being proposed for a specific site, including projects undergoing review under seeker. Well, the best tool for determining what regulatory issues a particular project may need to address is DEC's online EAF mapper, which automatically answers questions on the environmental assessment form, including questions about listed species. The environmental assessment form, or EAF, is a form used in the seeker review process, but you don't have to be actually submitting an EAF to use the EAF mapper. In the EAF mapper, you navigate to your site of interest, and then you can draw the boundaries of your project with your mouse, or you can specify or select a specific tax parcel, and then you can choose one of the buttons in the lower right here to answer questions on the full form EAF or the short form EAF, and it comes up with a environmental assessment form with many of the questions already answered. And so here's a section that deals with questions on biodiversity. And so section E, question 2.0 asks, does the project site contain any species of plant or animal that is listed by the federal government or by New York State as endangered or threatened. And it will either answer no, in which case the state doesn't have any information on listed species or their habitats. And by the state, that also means the Heritage Program in the vicinity of that project site. And there's no further need to address listed species. If it answers yes, as it does here, then we do have listed species in the vicinity of the site, and those species are listed. Which species they are listed here. And similarly, question .2.p asks, does the project site contain any species of plant or animal that is listed by New York State as rare? And that refers to the legal listing of rare for plants in the protected plant regulations, or is a species of special concern, and that's the listing of special concern for animals in the regulations. And again, you get a yes or no response. If you get a yes, you get it lists what that species is. A yes answer in the EAF mapper should be considered an initial screening and to be supplemented with more details about the species and its habitat at the project site during the course of the environmental review. So if the EAF mapper reports endangered or threatened animals, DEC recommends that the project sponsors contact the environmental permit staff and the appropriate DEC regional office for additional guidance, including for information about any permit considerations for the project and about potential impacts of the project on those species. And a note mainly for consultants, when only animals are listed by the EAF mapper, contacting the Heritage Program is not necessary. The DEC website includes an EAF workbook that provides guidance on filling out all the questions in the environmental assessment form, including the answers provided by the EAF mapper. If you do get plants or special concern animals reported by the EAF mapper, then you can certainly contact the Heritage Program for more information. Another tool is DEC's online environmental resource mapper, or ERM. And there are three main differences between the ERM and the EAF mapper. The ERM, is shown here, includes visual representations of the locations of the resources it's reporting. So in this example, the green here are regulated freshwater wetlands. The pink are significant natural communities from the Heritage Database. And the orange are locations of rare plants and animals from the Heritage Database. But since listed in rare plants and animals, they are only provided as generalized locations in the resource mapper here, because the precise locations are sensitive data. The resource mapper includes all species tracked in the Heritage Database. So in addition to what is in the EAF mapper, the ERM includes locations of unlisted animals and unlisted plants. If you click on a point, you get a pop-up that tells you what's in the vicinity of that point. But because the generalized locations are displayed, the exact species names are not provided for most state-listed animals. There's a tool called the Identify tool that if you click a point, symbolized by this red dot here, it will return a map and a report on the resources at that point or in the vicinity of that point. Here's a portion of the map that's returned, and here's a portion of the report. Includes what natural communities are in the vicinity and what rare plants and rare animals. And as you can see, for the New England cottontail, it specified that it was documented as occurring in the vicinity of that point. But for the rare plants listed as endangered or threatened or rare, or the rare animals, it just says that there are listed animals or listed plants. In the last line here, it says that the locations in the vicinity of rare animals that are not listed by New York State. Well, if some rare animals, even though they're not listed, there are aspects of them that make them sensitive to give out the location. So we just report that they're rare animals. So if you do have, so to recap, the ERM does provides generalized locations of both listed and unlisted species, but the unlisted species have no don't have any or little state regulatory protection per se. It provides the species names in some cases, and as with the EAF mapper, if you're if a threatened or endangered species, endangered animal is reported, contact the permit staff at the appropriate DEC regional office for further guidance. And but if you get a rare plant or an unlisted animal reported in the vicinity of your area of interest, you can obtain more information from the Heritage Program. And you can do that online. If you are requesting information in the context of a project review, we recommend using our online project screening request form or submitting an email to naturalheritage@dec.ny. And both those links and more instructions and guidance on submitting a request can be found on the DEC website at this link. So with that, I want to, on behalf of Dan and myself, I want to thank all of you for attending, and hopefully this was helpful to you. And we're certainly eager to take any questions you might have. And during the questions, I will put up this list of some of the links we talked about.
Thank you so much, Nick and Dan. That was really excellent. So we have a number of great questions. I'm going to start going back to the beginning where Dan spoke about the updates to the threatened and endangered species list. There was a question about why you can't just go ahead and use the 2019 proposal. Could you address that?
Sure. The 2019 effort wasn't a proposal. It was a pre-proposal. There was essentially a general request for information. And the information that came in, again, we started that process in 2015. The information that came in would result in several changes to the species designation for a number of species. And essentially, we just need to pull together those species status assessments. The head of our state wildlife action planning program retired, and there's just nobody to work on that. There's again, ultimately there's just too many species and not enough time and not enough people to work on them. The issue has been, for whatever reason, the idea was to make wholesale list changes at once. That's been the history for New York State, that the entire list has been revised at once. Going forward, that just isn't viable. And the intent is to kind of go through by taxonomic groups on a more regular basis. And that's what we're going to be trying to implement over the next 4 years. And hopefully that'll allow us to get onto a regular cycle of species updates that are a little bit more manageable with a couple of changes at a time. So that's the intent anyway.
Thank you. And just a reminder, if you have questions, please enter them through the Q&A function by clicking the 3 dots at the bottom right corner of the screen. The next question is about the reliance on breeding bird atlas data for updating the listing status. The person asked, they were curious why this reliance, since breeding is only one of the essential behaviors.
So the breeding bird atlas gives you the distribution of breeding birds, and it also gives you a change, basically a window into status change as far as how the population is doing. And while breeding is just a small component of it, the data that's collected through the BBA really is the best information that we have on the distribution of that particular species. And it's those changes in distribution that go into our assessment of trends that are primary criteria that are utilized. For some species in New York, like short-eared owl that don't breed here, golden eagles that don't breed here, the breeding bird atlas is just a small part of the picture. You look at things like the Christmas bird counts, the regional status of the species, as I mentioned before, some of the criteria that are used are the listing status in neighboring states and provinces. And that's essentially what leads to certain species being listed in New York, primarily either because of migratory situations such as golden eagle or wintering habitat, as is the case with short-eared owl. And then you also have the ability for the Fish and Wildlife Service, which has a much greater reach than we do. New York State biologists aren't going down to the Caribbean to check on wintering habitat, or up to the tundra of Canada to look at breeding habitat for taiga and tundra breeding birds that pass through New York State. But when the Fish and Wildlife Service is able to pull together that information and designate the status of species like red knots as threatened, they're automatically listed through our process. So, those species that aren't breeding in New York are picked up through other means such as those.
Thank you.
Yep.
So this next question may be for Nick. When considering the conservation rankings, how are potential non-direct impacts like global climate change or invasive species considered as threats? I suppose this may apply to both of you, the different rankings you discussed.
Yeah, so I mean, our biologists, so I laid out those ranking factors. And so when you're looking at threats, if you go use that matrix, but it may be there's I didn't even go into all the details of how those ranking factors are scored, and it's very complicated actually. And there's a tool that Nature Service developed called the rank calculator, but it takes into account somebody still has to make an assessment of, okay, climate change, is it going to affect this species? What's the degree of impact to that species and over what time period? And depending on the answers to those get factored into the scoring. And certainly, impacts of climate change have certainly been included in the ranking process much more in the last 20 years than they were before that.
Thanks. So there was also a question about whether, Dan, you could reiterate the why plants aren't included in the swap. And this person noted that they had recently become aware that plants were included in swaps in certain other states and were therefore eligible for funding.
Yeah, that's incorrect. I mean, any state can include plants in their swap, but they can't use funding on them. So some states have chosen to add plants in. There's been some suggested amendments to state wildlife action plans and state wildlife grants that would potentially allow funding for plants. There's a piece of legislation that just came out of committee yesterday called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act that would include plants in the state wildlife action plans. But as it stands right now, they're ineligible for funding under the state wildlife grant program. And, so New York has just made the decision at this point because we don't have regulatory authority over the plants. And until such time as the funding's there to actually bring people on board to do the work, to identify what plants should go into those lists and what work needs to be done for them, that, we'll wait, and we'll address that when it becomes an issue. And we'll need partners, because that's not under our authority. We need our partners with divisions of lands and forests and the heritage folks to jump in on that one.
Thank you.
Yep.
Have there been any recent discussions about regional lists for threatened, endangered, or special concern species? Long Island is very different from mainland New York, and terrestrial species emigration is complicated by being an island and the extreme urbanization of routes that these species must use to get onto the island.
Not at this point in time. Part of the problem is the way the law is written. It basically uses the word species. We have not had subspecies designated in New York, for example, let alone sort of like distinct population segment, which would be sort of the federal equivalent of what's being asked here. There certainly would be some value in, being able to protect particular pieces of the distribution of various species. And just because they're not listed as threatened or endangered doesn't mean that that's not work that people can do and focus on. And generally speaking, that's part of the purpose of our wildlife management area system, is to try to provide habitats throughout the state for the diversity of species. It's just not something that's viable under the current regulatory framework to kind of put that regulatory protection at that level.
Great, thank you.
I will add that there has been talk about Heritage doing regional ranks. So instead of assessing the status of the species as a whole in New York State, looking at Long Island, for example, and seeing, in addition to the ones that are imperiled in the state as a whole, are there any species that are doing well in other parts of the state but may not be doing well in Long Island? So there's been talk, but that would require more funding and a specific project to go through that process of doing regional conservation ranks.
Mm-hmm. Does the Natural Heritage Program take advantage of citizen science databases such as eBird, iNaturalist, et cetera? And if not, what other means does the public have to contribute sightings of rare species?
Excellent question. Yes, and yes and yes. We do. Our biologists take into account information from all sources when assessing the rank, or when finding locations to put in our database for the species we do track. So certainly over the last 10, 20 years, eBird and iNaturalist have become great sources of information, but we use information from unpublished reports, from academic researchers, from agency staff. We look at museum and herbarium specimens. So we use all information that we can get a hold of to assign our conservation status ranks and to enter records in our database. So if you are interested in submitting information to the Heritage Program on that you observed an observation of a rare species, we do have an online species reporting form at our website. So you just go to www.nynhp.org and you look for contribute data, and that will take you to a link to our online reporting form. And we encourage you to, there's a lot of fields in the form. You don't have to fill them all in, but we do encourage you to fill in as many as you can so that we have a complete record as possible of your observation.
Thanks. This next question gets to kind of the local role. In local site plan and building applications, the applicant is trusted to fill out the EAF form. They inevitably check the boxes as no that ask about the presence of threatened or endangered animals. They rely on the DEC database and don't bother to have their consultants check for themselves. How can the SECRA process be changed to require consultant biologists to check themselves?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Dan.
I think we were going to give the same answer. There's short of legislation that actually changes that whole process. I don't know what could be done as far as requirements. I mean, DEC really tried to do everything it could by sort of automating the form and encouraging people to use the online form that hits the database that actually populates the answer for them. So that if there is existing information, at least that would prohibit the individual from just clicking no without ever looking on anything. If lead agencies could essentially require applicants to potentially, utilize that online version of the database. The other side of the coin for where there is no existing information, and yes, 80% of New York hasn't been surveyed. DEC doesn't have access to private property just for surveying purposes. Same thing with heritage. We don't have the resources to do that. It would be great if lead agencies required site-specific surveys. Under SECR, it's really the lead agency that holds all the cards to require those kinds of things. We don't have the ability under the endangered species law or the ensuing regulations to kind of force a private landowner to look for something that may or may not be there. We're open to suggestions, but ultimately, I think it's going to be a sort of a group lift as opposed to any one agency that's going to be able to solve it. I don't know if you got anything else, Nick.
Yeah, so I will say that the EAF mapper, in addition to producing a EAF form with some of the answers filled out, there's an addendum at the end specifically from the EAF mapper. So the lead agency, our town board, can look for that also, or have the applicant submit that as proof that they use the EAF mapper. The other thing that I would suggest town boards do, or CACs, is go to the resource mapper, the environment resource mapper, and look at your town and sort of just get an idea of where there's information. You won't know the specific species necessarily, but you'll know what parts of the town, that will be flagged by the EAF mapper. And so you get a sort of a sense to if somebody submits an EAF and says no to those questions, you might say, wait a minute, I know that area is covered in the resource mapper, the ERM. And then you can go back to the applicant and make sure they do use that tool. So.
Thanks.
Mhm.
And I'll chime in that some communities we've been working with, and, have developed municipal natural resources inventories, and that those are great documents to refer to identify, not specific species locations, but they sometimes include some information about general locations of rare plant and animal species, and that planning boards can be referring back to those inventories to help guide their review and request more information from the applicants. I know it's 2 o'clock. We're going to hang on and maybe just take 1 or 2 more questions. Thank you so much again, Dan and Nick. There was a question, well, there are a few questions about bats, and specifically relating to Indiana bat and northern long-eared bat, and why it is allowed to remove trees during the winter months. Isn't that destroying their habitat?
Actually, for both species, both Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats, summer habitat is not limiting. The loss of summer habitat is really not a threat for them. It's really, it's two things. It's disturbance at the hibernacula, which are fully protected, and white nose syndrome itself, which generally attacks them over the hibernation period. So those are really the two. The habitat of concern is the hibernacula, and the threat that's actually impacting the populations is really the disease at this point. If you take a look at the distribution of the Indiana bat throughout most of its range outside of New York, New York is actually the most heavily forested state within its range. They generally are most abundant on landscapes that are between 10 and 30% forested. So, we actually don't find Indiana bats roosting in the middle of dense forest. They're usually roosting within a half mile of a forest edge. So that's basically the rationale for allowing the out of season removal of habitat.
And I've also been told that if a bat roosted in a tree during the summer and then that tree is cut down during the winter, as long as you don't remove all the trees in the area, when the bat comes back, it can easily roost in another tree, move to another tree.
Potentially, though, I do have to admit that if we know that there's a tree that's being used as a roost, we will work with the landowner to try to avoid removing that as part of the project.
Great. Are there any specific examples of species that have achieved delisting through successful management?
Well, it depends on what you call successful management, but I would say osprey and bald eagle are the most obvious examples. Arguably, I can't say is that we've achieved delisting of piping plover, but the population has gone from 98 pairs to over 400 breeding pairs through intense management and cooperation with the landowners and volunteer organizations throughout the Long Island district. So, we know management works, and it has the ability to increase populations and reduce the impact of threats. Peregrine falcons are another good example of a species whose numbers are actually above their historic populations at this point. Not in natural native habitats. That's sort of the weird thing with peregrine falcons. The vast majority of birds are nesting in what you would call definitely unnatural situations on bridges and skyscrapers and similar structures. but definitely the placement of boxes and the hacking of young birds back in the late 80s, early 90s was directly responsible for the population that we're seeing out there today.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap this up. There's one last question. Maybe you can leave us with some ideas for inspiration, just about what the general public can do to help, what resources are offered, such as training to help people become more aware and report presence or absence of a plant or animal.
I mean, I would suggest, among other things, Nick mentioned how folks could contribute data to the Natural Heritage Program, participation in programs such as the Breeding Bird Atlas, and providing your data to public resources such as iBird and iNaturalist helps get that information out there. Clearly, if you reach out to the Heritage Program, it's more likely that that information can get into the relevant databases that we use quicker. As far as training goes, there's a number of resources, whether there's birding resources, there's the Merlin app for your phone that's put out by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that helps you accurately identify birds that you might see, and through the eBird app allows you to essentially directly get that information out there to folks. There's similar types of apps for everything from frog calls to some of the guidance documents that I know that Nick's group is working on at Heritage for identifying like some of the pollinators, for example. And Nick, if you've got other examples.
I mean, if you're interested in learning more about, the natural history of the species around you, local state parks and DEC environmental education centers and land trust are a good resource. They're often offering workshops and field trips focused on natural habitats and species, native species. Yeah, and then there's also another online mapping app on the DC website called New York Nature Explorer, which takes a more general view, but you can go there and put in your town or your county and get a list of some of the species that have been found in that jurisdiction.
Thanks. And don't forget to check out our conservation planning website too, which has a lot of great educational resources. So thank you so much again to Nick Conrad and Dan Rosenblatt for your great presentation today. We will follow up and share the link to this recording and a PDF of the slides and contact information for Nick and Dan if you wish to follow up with any questions that we weren't able to answer today. So thanks again and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Okay. Thanks, Ingrid.
Ingrid, thanks everybody.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.